Imagine tonight you lay your body down in peace, allowing your breath to move in and out with a gentle rhythm, like the waves of the sea that have never ceased since the world was created. And you let your mind slowly release the burdens of the day that has passed, one by one, like dry leaves detaching from their branches, falling softly onto damp earth. And as your eyes begin to grow heavy, let me take you on a journey to a distant time, a time filled with shadows and silence. Time where the forgotten stories of small, nameless people still dwell without voice, waiting only to be touched by our imagination tonight. And as your body grows more relaxed, hear every word I speak, as if it were only a faint whisper floating in the air. No need to hurry, no need to search for answers, simply follow the flow. Let these words move like the calm current of a river, guiding you toward the valley of memories that once existed but are rarely spoken of, where small secrets of history wait to be rediscovered. Not as grand tales of kings or wars, but as fragments of simple lives that quietly shape the course of the world. Take another deep breath and imagine your body sinking further into the comfort of your bed, as if the mattress beneath you has transformed into soft earth on a wide green meadow, a meadow silent of human voices where only the rustling of leaves and the whisper of wind brushing over swaying grass can be heard. And in that place there is nothing for you to worry about. No obligations demanding you, no busyness pressing upon you, only time itself slowing down, allowing your mind to open and walk toward a time far behind us, a time so foreign yet strangely near. For we are all connected by ancient stories flowing within the blood of humanity, stories not written by the pens of kings or recorded in grand chronicles, but small, quiet, and often forgotten tales. Stories of people who were never given statues to remember them, who were never spoken of in the prayers of kingdoms, and yet they existed, they breathed, and then vanished within the great tide of history, and now in this silent night. Let us give space for those long-drowned voices to return, not with shouting, not with blinding light, but with gentle whispers, with faint shadows, with a calm tone that will accompany you into your sleep, so that you do not only hear tales of glory, but also fragments of fragile lives that quietly hold mysteries we may never truly understand. Imagine yourself slowly walking backward through time, moving further away from modern life with all its noise and commotion, until you arrive at a year known to many as the darkest in European history, the year 1347, when merchant ships sailing from the Black Sea into European harbors carried not only goods and spices, but also something unseen, something that quietly spread from port to village, from city to narrow street, from home to tightly closed home, a plague that would later be called the Black Death, a disease that spared no one, claiming the lives of both old and young, rich and poor, monks and peasants alike, as though every line of separation humans had built collapsed before an invisible and merciless force. And within that shadow, we can see a map stretching from Italy to England, from France to Germany, from bustling harbor towns to quiet villages, all swept by the same wave of suffering. And if you let your imagination wander further, you might picture the streets of those years, where the stench of bodies lying in city corners filled the daily air, where church bells tolled not for celebration, but for endless departures. Where people walked with their faces covered in cloth, soaked with vinegar, hoping it could shield them from what they could not see. And where fear grew so immense that many chose to abandon their homes. Villages became empty. Cities lost the noise of their markets. And open fields grew busier than the town squares, for there the fallen lay in silence. And yet, even as all this happened, life still continued in strange ways. For there were still hands that lit candles in churches, still hands that ground wheat, still children who somehow played among the ruins of life, as though the world wished to show that even amid total destruction, there remained small traces of continuity that never completely died. And it is there, within the fog of fear and despair, that the small stories of those never recorded, those forgotten by official chronicles, quietly shape the world we know today. If you sharpen your imagination on the map spread before you, you might see how every point of the cities wrapped in that dark fog seemed to pulse with fear, and one of the centers of it all were the Italian port cities such as Genoa and Messina, where ships carrying rats and fleas, the carriers of disease, first docked, unloading their cargo mixed with something invisible, something that rushed swiftly through narrow alleys, past tightly packed stone buildings, crossing small rivers that cut through the cities, until it ensnared people who had no chance of knowing what awaited them. And from there, within months, the chain of contagion spread northward, seizing great cities like Florence, Paris, and London, leaving behind silent traces of deserted streets, neglected markets, and houses locked tightly with red crosses painted on their doors, a sign that within lay suffering that could no longer be avoided. And if we lower our gaze deeper into each of those cities, we might find that behind the sturdy stone walls, there were people trying to endure in the ways they believed, some seeking salvation through endless prayers, some through wild feasts as though laughter could drive death away, and others choosing the quiet path, gathering in small groups, whispering secrets, forging unwritten pacts, as if they sought to build an invisible fortress that could protect their souls from terrible certainty. And these small groups, often unrecorded in official chronicles, slowly became a kind of shadow society, born not from political power or wealth, but from shared fear and a shared longing to find meaning amid destruction. And if you walked those alleys in those dark years, you might feel that every corner held a secret breath, every closed door held a story, and every flickering candlelight seemed to signal that even though the world was broken by disease, humanity still searched for bonds, for answers, and for ways to endure in silence. Imagine that, beyond the great cities loud with the clatter of hooves and the cries of markets, there were small villages forgotten among forests and hills, where news of the plague arrived late but eventually reached them nonetheless. And in those villages, dirt roads that once rang with the laughter of children suddenly grew deserted. Fields and farmlands were left untended as farmers fell ill one by one, and rivers once alive with washing and chatter turned into silent streams, reflecting only the bowed shadows of trees, as though nature itself lowered its head in mourning for human suffering. And in that silence, villagers tried to make sense of it in simple ways, some blaming spirits that were said to emerge from the woods at night, others believing this was punishment for sins they could not understand, while still others simply accepted it without words, for life was already burdened with hardship. And the arrival of the plague was only another layer of suffering to be endured. And if you were to walk along that village path on a dark night, you might see wooden houses with doors shut tight, leaving only dim light seeping through the cracks of the boards, where families huddled in unspoken fear, praying that the next dawn would still meet their eyes. And in that state, some villages began to form ways of survival by building small circles of solidarity, placing food before abandoned houses or digging graves together for neighbors whose families could no longer bury them, and without realizing it. These acts gave birth to new customs, an ethic within despair that showed how humanity still tried to preserve its essence, even when life seemed to collapse entirely. And perhaps within those circles of silence were born the faint stories of secret societies never recorded in history. Books, a shadowy network forged not with ink and parchment, but with togetherness, fear, and a yearning not to disappear completely from the world. When the sun began to rise with a pale light that no longer held warmth, daily life in the village, besieged by the plague, turned into a ritual of recurring fear, and everyone walked through the day with cautious steps, as if the very earth could spread the sickness, so that the market, which once stood as the heart of life, became only an empty stretch with a few abandoned wooden tables, fruits rotting in baskets with no hand daring to touch them, woven cloth once hung as a sign of trade, now draped in a thin layer of dust. And even the crowing of roosters no longer felt welcoming, for morning no longer carried the promise of life, but the looming possibility of death. And among the wooden houses, people's routines were filled with anxious acts. Some lit small bonfires at their doors to drive away spirits they believed carried the disease. Others hung dry twigs or charms from village healers, hoping the air around their homes would be purified, though no one truly knew if it helped. Yet all was done to calm the heart a little, and inside the houses, simple tasks like grinding wheat, cooking porridge, or stitching cloth turned into slow, deliberate movements, as though each person saved their strength, knowing their body might fail at any moment. And even conversations among family members often stopped halfway through a sentence, because of the fear hanging in the air. Only the sound of coughing from another room serving as a reminder that the sickness was real drawing nearer, and showing no mercy, and though fear dominated, humans still sought to preserve the shape of daily life. Children who survived sometimes played with stones or sticks, though their parents' eyes always watched anxiously, as if every laugh might turn into crying in an instant. And at night, when the sky was dark without a moon, the village was wrapped in such dense silence that the soft footsteps of mice in the granary sounded loud, and people often gazed out of small windows, hoping for a sign that it would soon end, though deep in their hearts they knew there was no certain answer. And among all that uncertainty, new habits emerged that kept life moving forward, such as reciting long prayers before sleep. Prayers that not only begged for safety, but also steeled their souls to accept whatever might come, for in the midst of destruction they could not control. The only thing they still could do was hold on to a fragment of peace within their hearts. And that was what allowed them to pass those terrifying nights one by one, even without certainty that the next dawn would truly be theirs to see. On a narrow street that cut through the village, there unfolded a sight that grew stranger with each passing day. For the path once filled with footsteps, children's laughter, and the cries of merchants, offering goods, had become nothing more than a long, silent corridor, coated with dust carried by the wind, and on either side the wooden houses stood like hollow bodies without souls. Their windows shut tight, their doors rarely opened, and before some houses there lay faint signs, black cloth, or chalk marks, scratched onto planks, marks that meant the occupants had fallen ill or were no more, and those still alive walked past such signs with quick glances, never daring to stare too long, as if their very eyes could catch the sickness. And what was striking was that though fear pressed so heavily, humans still sought meaning in every detail. So some villagers began to believe the direction of the wind carried death. Others watched the movements of crows on rooftops as omens of who would be called next, while others simply closed their eyes and left everything to prayer. Yet whatever the form of their beliefs, all grew from the same need to grasp what could not be controlled. And amidst that silence, the soft ringing of a bell was sometimes heard, rung by a figure walking down the street, clad in long garments and a veiled face, carrying a wooden staff to keep distance. This person was not a merchant nor a neighbor, but one appointed by the village to gather those who no longer lived. And each time the bell rang, the people behind windows held their breath, closed their eyes, or pressed their bodies closer together. For the sound of the bell was not only a sign that someone was gone, but a reminder that their own turn might not be far, and at the same time, simple life still struggled to persist. An old woman could be seen sweeping her yard with a straw broom, though no visitor would ever come. A young man still patched his roof with sticks and clay, though he knew the rains might never arrive before death did. And in dim kitchens, mothers continued to cook thin porridge from dwindling grains, giving it to children, who ate slowly with weary eyes, and all of this unfolded in a rhythm. So slow it was as though the world had lost part of its pulse, yet it still beat faintly enough to keep time from ceasing entirely. And when night returned, the sky seemed heavier, filled with dark clouds that smothered the stars, so the village appeared isolated from the world, a tiny speck swallowed by silence, and within each person's heart there grew resignation entwined with hope. Two feelings in conflict, yet walking side by side, for none knew if they would awaken the next morning. Yet still they closed their eyes with prayers, hoping that the dreams of the night would be kinder than the reality they would face when dawn returned. Inside those shuttered houses there lay small objects, silent witnesses 2 days slowly eroded by fear and loss. A wooden chair once used for shared sitting now stood empty in the corner, dusty, its surface cracked by time, as though holding the memory of bodies that once leaned but no longer remained. The long table once filled with clay plates and coarse bread now bore only a half-empty jug of water, and the sound of spoons striking bowls had not been heard for long. On the cold floor there lay a small wooden toy horse toppled on its side, abandoned by tiny hands that never returned to play with it, while on the wall still hung a worn woven cloth with a simple motif, its threads fraying, its colors fading. As if refusing to fall, though, the house had lost its pulse, and in the kitchen, the hearth once ablaze now held damp ashes. leaving only a faint scent of burned wood lingering in the air. Proof that there had once been life striving to endure, once warm meals shared with loving hands. Though all had now ceased, and in the absence of sound, those objects grew louder in their presence. They could not speak, yet their silence carried deeper stories than words. As though every scratch in the wood, every frayed thread, and every grain of dust clinging to the surfaces was a record of final days. And when someone still living stepped into such a room, they often paused long, staring at those objects with hollow eyes, unsure whether to feel sadness, anger, or simply accept that time had stopped here. And there is something uncanny about inanimate things, for though they neither breathe, nor feel, nor know, they still become more faithful guardians of memory than humans themselves. They do not leave, they do not forget. They simply remain, standing in stillness, waiting for whoever dares return to remember. And in that silence, a realization emerges that history does not live only in records or stories, but also in trivial objects left behind. A broken wooden spoon, a cracked clay pot, a piece of cloth still faintly scented, ost, and even a shard of candle wax frozen upon a table. For that candle once burned to light the face of someone now gone, and the shadows it cast upon the wall long vanished. Yet the remnant of wax remains, waiting to speak to whoever can listen with the eyes of the heart. And thus each house becomes a kind of invisible tomb, not only for bodies, but for memories, for simple routines, and for the small sounds that once filled the air. And though people fear to linger too long inside abandoned homes, they still feel drawn to glance briefly, as if to reassure themselves that life had truly existed there. And in an instant, a faint longing seeps in, not only for the people who had gone, but also for the ordinary life itself, life once deemed simple and dull, yet now so precious. And these objects, in their silence, act as mirrors, reflecting back to any who see them the questions that remain so hard to answer. What it means to endure, what it means to lose, and what it means to leave behind something that continues even when we no longer are. So that within a dim room, with the scent of damp wood dust and frozen time, those small objects teach what they never intended, that silence can be louder than cries, and stillness can contain more stories than a book. At night, when the last light faded and the sky filled with cold stars, the village seemed to transform into another world. A space detached from everyday reality, the narrow streets covered in long shadows cast by tightly standing houses, and the wind slipping through cracks in wooden doors produced faint sounds, like whispers arriving from places unseen, so subtle that those who heard them could not tell whether they were real or merely echoes of their own minds. Sometimes the faint sound of small footsteps echoed on the stone path, though no one was outside, and those steps would suddenly stop, leaving behind a silence heavier than the sound itself. The remaining dogs often barked for no reason, staring into the dark as if perceiving something invisible to human eyes, while cats that once roamed boldly now hid more often, their eyes glowing in the dark, following movements that could not be seen, and inside the houses. Survivors sometimes woke at the sound of a door creaking, though all were locked, or the crash of an object falling in the kitchen, though nothing had moved. and those sounds felt so real they pierced with fear, not only because of their strangeness, but because deep down they knew those houses were once full, and the noises seemed like traces of life still trying to return, as though the shadows of the past refused to leave entirely, and in the stillness of night, every small sound grew larger. Heartbeats thudded, breathing echoed. Even the crack of wood under cold seemed like someone walking slowly. And the longer the night stretched, the thicker the sense that the village was not only inhabited by the living, but also by unseen presences. Presences that might be only memories unwilling to fade, or something beyond easy explanation, and for those who sat quietly near dead hearths, hugging themselves for warmth, it often felt as though those sounds were not threats, but reminders that the houses once lived, the streets once bustled, and the life that was lost had not vanished completely, but clung to the air, the stones, the wood, every wall, holding echoes of laughter and sorrow. And perhaps that was why sleep on those nights felt heavy, because whenever eyes closed, the sounds returned, whether from outside or within. And time seemed to stretch, making the night feel longer than usual, darker, colder, and more full of something that could never be explained, a mystery without end. One that only deepened the more people tried to understand. And thus, the night in that village became a kind of liminal space, not entirely real, yet not entirely illusion, a thin bridge between the living and the gone, between the world that can be touched and the world that can only be felt, and in that bridge, people had to learn to accept that not every question has an answer, and not every sound can be explained. When the sun finally rose after the long night, the village seemed to breathe again, though its breaths were short and faltering. The light falling upon thatched roofs carried a little warmth, yet not enough to drive away the cold that had lingered so long. The remaining people stepped out cautiously, as if every corner of the street still held something untouchable, and they began their day with simple activities once considered ordinary, but now felt like attempts to preserve the remnants of sanity. An old woman, for example, sat on a low stool before her house, laying out worn cloths to dry after washing them in cold water. Her movements were slow, yet filled with persistence, for her washing was no longer about cleaning fabric, but about declaring that life still continued. A middle-aged man was seen chopping wood with a blunt axe. Each strike sounded heavy, heavier than it should, and at times he paused, staring long at the wood as though it held answers to unspoken questions. In another yard, a young boy tried to kindle a small fire with dry straw. He blew again and again, thin smoke rising. Yet the flame refused to stay, and when it finally caught, his face lit with a faint satisfaction, though only for a moment, for he quickly remembered that the fire was not for celebration, but merely to warm stiff hands. Meanwhile, in the small market that once bustled, now only 2 or 3 wooden tables stood, without tents, without the cries of merchants. Only meager goods remained, some salted fish laid upon worn cloth, a small basket of apples already wilting, and a half-filled bottle of oil. Transactions took place with little speech, more in glances and nods, for people avoided too many words, perhaps fearing that words carried something unseen, And though there was light, though there was activity, the air remained heavy, a weight not lifted by their attempts at normalcy, for every simple gesture reminded them of all that was lost. The streets they walked now empty of running children, the well now silent without laughter of those fetching water. Even the crow of a rooster, once a sign of life, now sounded like an echo from the past. People did what they could, weaving, mending tools, tending small gardens, yet all was done differently, as if every act were merely ritual against the silence of the world. And from outside, it might appear that life went on, but within, everyone knew what they did was only survival, survival in a world that had lost its balance. And though the sun stood high above, its light could not erase the shadows clinging to the village, shadows born of the long night that never truly ended. And thus the day in that village became an extension of night, only in a different color, still with the same silence, still with the same mystery that never departed. In the abandoned houses, time seemed to freeze. The cracked wooden walls that once sheltered families now stood in silence, holding secrets never spoken. Upon a long, dust-covered table still lay a piece of hardened bread, as if waiting for hands that would never return to touch it. Clay bowls lined the shelves, some cracked, some intact, yet all empty. And the stillness surrounding these objects turned them into artifacts from another world, as if simple items had become mute witnesses of a tragedy greater than what four walls could contain. In the corner stood a small tilted wooden chair, as though someone had once sat there and left without tidying it. On the floor remained dried traces of muddy footprints, leaving patterns that told of final steps toward the outside, toward the unknown. In the bedroom, a cloth doll lay on a small bed, its eyes made of two buttons nearly undone. Its fabric faded, yet its form still showed that it once was a child's companion. A child, perhaps, long gone with the fearful night. On another shelf stood a small glass bottle filled with thick, dark brown liquid. Perhaps medicine, perhaps only a drink, but now no one could be sure. The object merely stood in silence. Part of a story never completed. Near the window lay a thin book with a leather cover, its pages yellowed, some folded. Within were brief notes of grain stock, livestock numbers, and the weather of past seasons. Notes that ended abruptly in mid-sentence, as if the pen had fallen and was never lifted again. Every object in that house seemed to speak without voice, conveying small stories cut short. And when someone entered to observe, they felt a strange pressure, as though the room was still filled with unseen presence, not ghosts, not shadows, but something more subtle, more delicate, like the trace of a breath left hanging in the air. Those who dared to enter rarely stayed long, for though their eyes saw only dust and lifeless objects, their hearts felt something much heavier. And in the end, they would close the door again, leaving the house wrapped in its secrets, as though it was better to let the past rest than to awaken it. For the past in that village was not mere memory, but a wound still fresh, a wound refusing to dry though time continued to flow, and every empty house became a silent monument, a reminder that life could stop suddenly, leaving behind trivial objects that transformed into markers that once there was laughter, once there was conversation, once there was song before it all vanished. and thus walking past those houses felt like walking past open graves, without headstones, only aging wooden walls as witnesses. Night in that village always arrived with a heavy feeling, as though the shadows of the dark years never truly left. When the sun began to sink behind the hills, the atmosphere changed slowly. The bird song diminished. The wind that once blew gently turned cold and piercing. The trees along the road creaked softly, as if delivering whispers no one could understand. The few remaining villagers, whose number was but a handful, were accustomed to closing their doors earlier than most. They lit oil lamps and placed them in the corners of their rooms, not only for illumination, but also as a kind of ward, for they believed light could hold back something unseen from entering. Outside, the cobblestone paths fell silent, only occasionally broken by the bark of a distant dog, which then abruptly ceased as if the sound itself feared to continue. The empty houses stood like black silhouettes, their dark windows resembling watchful eyes. And for anyone daring to walk through those alleys at night, their footsteps would sound louder than usual, echoing against the frail wooden walls, making them feel less alone, though no one was truly there. At the center of the village was an old well, its water rarely used, for it was deemed unclean. That well was often mentioned in hushed stories. Some claimed to hear sounds from within on certain nights, faint noises like coughing or broken prayers. No one knew whether it was merely echoes from the depths of the earth or something darker. Yet each time someone approached it after dusk, their hair stood on end, and they would quickly retreat, leaving the well to its silence. Many believed that at night the village was still inhabited by the final breaths of those lost, not in the form of apparitions that showed themselves, but in subtler ways, in the chill that seeped through, in the weight pressing upon the chest, in the silence that strained the ears. And though those who remained tried to live ordinarily, night continued to carry the feeling that time could at any moment turn back, bringing once again the shadows that had never truly departed. They drew their curtains tightly shut, unwilling to look outside, as though a glance could summon what should remain asleep. And the night stretched slowly on, each hour lengthening, while the people waited for dawn, as if waiting for salvation, hoping sunlight would be strong enough to drive away the fear. Though they knew light only postponed, never erased, for what hid within the darkness was not something the morning could wash away, but something rooted in the soil, in the stones, in the very air of the village itself. For the villagers who survived in that place, the faint sounds at night were no longer something surprising, but rather a part of life that had to be quietly accepted. When the sky was dark and filled with stars, or even when clouds veiled the moon, there were always moments when the air carried noises that could not be explained. Sometimes it sounded like slow footsteps crossing the cobblestone path, though no one was outside. Sometimes it resembled the creak of a wooden door opening slightly and then closing again, even though those abandoned houses had not been touched in years. Some even claimed to hear the rustle of cloth, as if someone in a long robe was walking through the deserted alleys of the village. Those who heard such sounds usually did not try to investigate. They simply remained still, holding their breath, allowing the noise to pass, for they believed the more one tried to follow or resist, the closer the shadows of the past would cling to them. On certain nights, when the wind blew from the direction of the old well, there came a sound like a whispered prayer, long, faint, fragmented, unclear in any language. Some believed it to be the prayers of those who once died in the midst of the plague, prayers left unfinished prayers, now endlessly replaying in the air as if trapped in a loop of time. There were also sounds of harsh, dry coughs, tearing, as though coming from a sick chest, and these always made listeners uneasy. For the cough was too real, too close to the grim reality still etched in collective memory. Most villagers were no longer startled. They passed the night calmly, covering their ears with blankets or reciting prayers silently. But the younger ones, or travelers who occasionally passed through, often could not sleep, their eyes wide open, waiting for the next sound, and it was that fear which stretched the night longer, which made the air heavier until they realized that this village was not merely a dwelling, but a vessel for memories that could not be erased, memories that chose to persist in the form of sound, in the form of faint footsteps, in the form of winds carrying the burden of history. No one knew why those sounds remained, whether they truly came from restless souls or were merely psychological echoes passed down from generation to generation. A collective fear that birthed noises within imagination. Yet no one dared to call it an illusion, for illusions should not leave such tangible coldness in the bones, should not make one feel watched from behind an empty window, should not make a dog bark into the darkness and then fall silent with its tail tucked. All of it was real to them, real in a way different from the everyday world, real in a way that could not be denied. Thus the nights in that village always moved in the same rhythm, silence interrupted by faint noises, closed in exhaustion, and finally rescued by the morning light, only to repeat once more the next night, as though the village itself was bound to a cycle that could not be broken, a cycle that preserved memory so it would never truly disappear. Inside the old houses that now stood half-collapsed in the village, there were still small objects left behind, as if time had stopped at the very moment the plague struck. In the dusty corners lay a cracked wooden bowl, still containing hardened black grains, perhaps once wheat or barley. On a wooden shelf sat a clay jug with its mouth sealed by a crust of white, a sign that the water inside had long dried up. There was also a half-melted candle left extinguished upon the table. That candle seemed like the mark of someone who once waited in the dark, hoping the light would not go out, but finally surrendered to a night too long to endure. Near the window often lay pieces of tattered cloth, some in the form of cloaks, others merely thin linen, some covered with patches, some shredded by rats. Those fabrics were silent, yet they seemed to hold stories, every fold carrying the trace of a body that once wore them. A small writing desk with a shaky leg remained. Upon it, faint carvings were still visible, perhaps the initials of a name or just the careless marks of children. On the ground, shards of small cups were scattered, their edges sharp, glimmering when touched by moonlight, as though those fragments refused to vanish from memory. There were also small, empty wooden boxes, perhaps once holding salt, spices, were valuables hastily removed. In the bedroom stood a wooden bed frame without its mattress, its hard structure surrounded by dust, riddled with tiny holes from termites, yet still upright, as if refusing to fall, as if waiting for bodies that never returned. Upon that bed frame, traces of rats were often found. But among their droppings, there was sometimes something more unsettling. A strand of long hair caught within the cracks of the wood, brittle, faded. Crumbling at the slightest touch, near the bed there were sometimes small wooden sandals. So tiny they must have belonged to children. Abandoned either in haste or intentionally placed so they would not be forgotten. These objects had no value to outsiders, merely remnants, fragments of lives long gone. But to the villagers, they were reminders, mute witnesses of a time when life moved with slower breaths, when every simple thing held meaning far greater than itself. Those objects were also burdens, difficult to discard, impossible to erase, as though they refused to vanish. Refusing to be separated from the soil where they were born, and in that way they became part of the village's soul, unmovable, unsellable, unreclaimable, only to be gazed upon in silence and left in their place, waiting for another to rediscover their quiet presence. Those objects were witnesses of a time when no one knew whether tomorrow would still exist. Witnesses of a grief too immense to be put into words, witnesses of a loss that never truly healed. The remaining villagers often looked upon those old objects with a gaze mixed with reverence and fear, rarely daring to move them, let alone discard them, as though those objects had a right to remain where they were. Like immovable markers that should never be shifted in the rooms of houses that were nearly collapsed. Those who lived nearby sometimes still entered, not to take, but to ensure everything stayed as it had been, as though they were guarding something that must not be touched. There was a faint belief, passed down from mouth to mouth, that those objects held the souls of those long gone, that every cracked bowl, every worn cloth, and every extinguished candle was a small prison for a spirit that had not fully departed. Thus they left them undisturbed, untouched, only glanced at briefly before leaving. On certain nights, especially when rain fell heavily, the sound of water dripping upon the roofs of empty houses was heard like whispers. Villagers believed it was the voices of those still waiting, whispers too distant to be understood, yet too near to ignore. A few times young villagers dared to take one of the objects, perhaps a candle or a shard of a cup, and always something happened that quickly made them return it. Some fell ill without reason. Some were plagued by recurring nightmares. Others lost their way when walking through the forest. Thus they came to understand that these objects were not merely remnants of the past, a part of something greater, something inseparable from the soil itself. The elders often spoke calmly, saying the village stood upon a fragile layer of time, that each small object was a key to maintaining balance. And if that key was lost or moved, the village would lose its foundation and everything could collapse without warning. Thus a kind of simple ritual was born without long prayers, without elaborate ceremonies, only a quiet custom. Whenever someone passed by an old house, they bowed their head, slightly, as if in respect, or tapped the rotten wooden door once with their fingertip, then continued on their way. It was not a written rule, yet all did it. Even outsiders who came eventually imitated it. as if something in the air compelled them to join. And from that habit came a sense of peace. For in this way they believed they would not disturb whoever still lingered among those mute objects. Life thus continued in a slow rhythm, where people no longer dared to challenge memory, but instead guarded it with gentle persistence. And though the burden was heavy, they embraced it, for without it, their village would be nothing but an empty place devoid of soul. As time passed, the village began to be the subject of conversation among travelers, who stopped at nearby town markets. Those who had once taken the narrow path to the village always described the same impression: an unnatural silence, air that felt heavier than usual, and the villagers' gaze that never seemed to meet the eyes of those they spoke to. These stories spread slowly, from mouth to mouth, made the village known not for its harvests or the beauty of its fields, but for the strange aura that clung to it. Outsiders began to call it a place guarded by something unseen. Some even refused to take the road leading there, claiming they did not wish to bring home ill fortune that might cling unnoticed. In certain seasons, when fog descended from the valley, the road to the village nearly vanished, as if the fog drew a thick curtain over it. And merchants preferred to take long detours rather than attempt to pass through it. They said that the fog there was not ordinary fog, but the breath of the past still unwilling to depart. Outsiders who dared to enter always returned with stories difficult to explain. Some claimed they heard footsteps following them, though no one was behind. Others felt a piercing chill seeping through the walls of empty houses. And some found dried flowers neatly placed upon old gravestones, though no one was seen entering the cemetery. These stories accumulated, becoming a new layer covering the old tale of the plague that once extinguished so many lives. To outsiders, the village became a living legend, a place that could not be understood through a single visit. While to those who still remained there, all the outsiders' tales were but echoes of what they had always known. To them, it would be strange if outsiders did not feel a presence, for their lives had long been interwoven with memories that could not be erased. They were accustomed to footsteps and silent nights, two doors creaking though untouched, two shadows moving slowly at the edge of vision, no longer as threats, but as part of daily existence to be accepted. And because of this, they regarded outsiders with calm, neither trying to convince nor to deny, only letting each person carry home their own experience, like a mirror reflecting only what one brought into it. The village became a space where past, present, and perhaps something beyond met in silence, and outsiders could only sense as deeply as they dared allow themselves to sink within it. The village slowly shaped itself as a space that felt detached from the flow of time. Not that clocks did not tick or seasons failed to change, but everything seemed to proceed with such a slow rhythm, as if the days merely repeated the same pattern without truly moving forward. Outsiders who stayed even briefly often felt they were in a place where time was held still. Like a sheet of water that did not flow, they sensed a silence different from ordinary quiet, a silence that was not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of meaningful motion. Wooden houses that still stood appeared unchanged from one year to the next. Fading paint did not worsen, Dusty windows remained dusty in the same way. Even the cobbled paths that rain passed over seemed never to erode, only wet and then dry, as if all was enclosed in a thin layer shielding it from the wear of time. The villagers lived within this rhythm, lighting fires in their hearths during winter, laying out their small harvests to dry in summer, but all of it done in a way that seemed unanchored to any particular year. There was no haste, no effort to chase after something fleeting. Their lives seemed drawn back from the outer world, which moved on with the clamor of trade, war, and kingdoms. They simply lingered within a circle of slow routines. With faces difficult to read as either young or aged, for visitors, this created a strange feeling, as if everyone in the village was a keeper of some secret greater than themselves, yet they never spoke of it, never offered the slightest hint, only greeted with vague glances and smiles whose meanings could not be discerned. In that stillness, small sounds became deeply significant. The chime of a small bell hanging on a door, the wind sweeping across roof tiles, the rustle of cloth as a woman closed a window, all of it sounded clearer, slower, and heavier, like echoes bouncing from the stone walls of a cavern. The village gave the impression of not entirely belonging to the living world, but instead resting within the narrow gap between life that continues and memory unwilling to release its hold. Outsiders often said that being there was like walking within a long dream where everything felt real, yet fragile, ready to vanish at any moment. And perhaps that was what kept the village alive, not because it refused to die, but because it chose to remain at the edge between being and nothingness. Among all the things that seemed unchanged, it was the small objects in the village that stirred stronger. Curiosity, as though each one carried a memory frozen in place. A clay vessel in the corner of a house remained, where it had always been, its color fading but never cracking. An old book on a wooden shelf stayed open on the same page, as if the last hand that touched it had stopped there and time itself refused to continue the story. Even a wooden cup on a kitchen table always appeared half filled with water that never fully dried, as though this village was bound by some strange pact with the past, never to let anything shift. And visitors who dared to touch these objects often claimed they felt a chill creeping into their palms. Not a chill born of air, but a touch of memory unwilling to release its hold. Many said they sensed faint whispers, not from human mouths, but from the objects themselves, as if they contained the voices of those who once owned them. Voices caught between the desire to be remembered and the fear of being forgotten. Often at night, when only a torch or a candle flickered on a table, these objects seemed to emit a dim glow. Not a flame's brightness, but a pale shimmer more like the reflection of something buried deep within time. And those who saw it felt as if they were being summoned to listen to a story left unfinished. And indeed, that was the sensation, that the village was not only inhabited by those who still walked its lanes, but also by a layer of memory embodied in objects, preserving fragments of tales from people long gone. A vessel once belonging, perhaps, to a mother who never returned from her last winter, or a book abandoned by a young monk who came to bring comfort during the plague. Each became like a small window connecting the present to an unreachable world, a world where questions never receive answers, and silence remains the only language left. The daily routines of the villagers, which still seem to unfold like shadows of the past, always stirred a sense of unease, as if what one witnessed were not living people, but reflections of something long halted. When dawn slowly rose from behind the forest, a thin mist descended and covered the cobbled streets. Their figures appeared moving in the same patterns each day. An old man walked from his hut to the well at the village center, drew water, then paused to stare blankly at the mountains, as if waiting for an answer that would never arrive while a young woman could be. Seen carrying a basket of cloth, stepping toward the small river, washing clothes with slow, repetitive motions. Yet, though the basket was empty when examined, she always returned in the same way. Like an actor endlessly performing on a stage with no audience, children were also seen running along the paths, laughing without sound, their feet dusty, yet leaving no footprints, and sometimes they suddenly stopped, staring at something unseen by ordinary eyes, before resuming their run as if nothing was strange. Some villagers could be found sitting before their homes, weaving or carving wood, but when observed longer, the woven cloth never grew, and the carved wood always returned to its original shape, as though time refused progress. All these activities appeared simple, the kind that in other villages might be considered ordinary, but here they unfolded without change, without purpose. Like a song played endlessly with no conclusion, and visitors often felt they were not witnessing real life, but peering into reflections of a past trapped like a recording on repeat. A reminder that life once present now lingered only as faint traces compelled to continue by something unexplained. A life neither truly living nor entirely dead. The village road itself seemed like a vein that had long ceased to pulse, yet still kept its shape. The round stones once laid carelessly in the past, now covered with moss, some cracked, some half buried into the soil, as though the earth was slowly trying to swallow back the traces of man. Along this road stood wooden houses with faded walls, thatched roofs already blackened, some leaning as if waiting for the moment to finally collapse, but for some reason never falling. Each house had doors that rarely opened, small windows with worn fabric curtains that swayed lightly even when no wind was felt. If one dared to step closer, they would see the houses were empty. No furniture inside save for a broken wooden chair, a table with a dusty surface, or a cold stone hearth. Yet a faint aroma of burnt wood lingered as if activity had just ended. There were also faint sounds of knocking or scraping, but when the door was opened, only silence awaited. As though this village were a vast stage filled with props from a life already gone, and the people who still seemed alive were merely shadows clinging to those remnants. On one side of the road stood an old well with mossy stone edges, its rope frayed. But when the wooden bucket was lowered, the sound of water could be heard far below, though no one had ever seen it fill. Near the well stood a wooden post with remnants of a rotted knot, and some believed it had once been used to hang someone accused of bringing a curse, while others said it was merely a place to hang a lantern to light the path. No one truly knew. At the end of the road stood a small stone chapel, its door half open, the cross on its roof tilted. The small bell in its tower already cracked, and if one stood long enough before it, sometimes a faint toll could be heard, though no rope was pulled and no hand moved it. All these details added layers of strangeness, not easily explained. Like a village left frozen between reality and memory, between life and death, so that all that remained was an atmosphere endlessly repeating itself, waiting for someone brave enough to interpret its meaning. The small chapel seemed to be the very center of silence, its stone walls damp with moss creeping upward slowly, the simple carvings above the door almost erased, leaving only faint lines that might once have been a cross or the face of a saint. Inside, the air felt heavy, a mixture of wet earth and candles that had once burned too long the wooden. Pews neatly arranged were partly decayed, their surfaces carved with small marks perhaps made by mischievous children or adults wishing to leave traces of despair. At the front altar stood a stone statue of the Virgin Mary, her face partially flaked away. The eyes of the statue appeared hollow, and many believed that on certain nights the statue seemed to gaze directly at anyone entering the room. At the foot of the altar lay a pile of tangled black cloth, perhaps an old monk's robe, or perhaps a burial shroud once used to cover a corpse. No one knew for sure. In the corner of the room hung a small, cracked bell, and some villagers who still remembered the past said that the bell rang by itself at certain moments, especially when death approached, yet strangely. Though the village had long been silent, that faint toll was still sometimes heard, as if to remind that the spirits had not fully left. Some visitors claimed to have heard whispered prayers in Latin, though clearly no one was inside. Only shadows moved slowly across the wall. As though invisible candles were burning, this chapel became the center of stories that never ended. Some said the monks once used this place to hide when the plague began to spread. They prayed each night that the sickness would not touch the village. But their prayers were never answered, and one by one their bodies were found frozen in kneeling positions, as if they had died in silent prayer. This tale made the chapel never truly abandoned. For everyone who entered felt that something still watched, waited, and breathed within its cold walls. The silence inside was profound, yet a silence that was noisy because it left too many questions that could not be answered. There's a story passed down faintly from mouth to mouth about the last 3 people said to have entered the chapel before the village became truly deserted. They were an old woman known as the Keeper of the Keys, a young man who worked as a field guard, and a small child whose name was never known. People said the 3 of them entered the chapel as the sun was nearly setting, carrying several candles and a bundle of fresh wildflowers. After that, no one ever saw them come out. The chapel door remained tightly closed, and when it was finally opened many years later, no trace of bodies or belongings that could prove their presence was found. Only melted wax on the floor, and the faint scent of dried flowers lingering in the air as though time had stopped there. This tale gave rise to many interpretations. Some believed they chose to end their lives by praying until their final breath. Others thought they were absorbed into a mysterious space that could not be explained, and still others said they were still there, but in a form unseen by ordinary eyes, only felt through whispers or shadows that moved too quickly to grasp. Villagers who later wandered near the chapel often spoke of small footsteps circling the stone floor, as if a child was running without a body, or of a woman's shadow sometimes seen sitting on a wooden bench holding a large key in her hand, while the voice of a young man was faintly heard, as if calling someone's name from far away. All of this made the chapel a place where the boundary between the real world and the unseen seemed too thin. The silence there was not empty, but full of presences that could not be explained. As if the chapel itself refused to release those who once sought shelter within it, and in a way never understood, the story of those last three people still lived on, lingering among the old stones in the damp air. In every candle said to light itself, making people wonder whether they truly vanished or instead remained there, waiting without sound. Before the tale of the last three spread, the village once tried to endure through simple means that now sound almost impossible to the remaining inhabitants. Still lit wood stoves in houses with leaking roofs, they dried nearly rotten wheat in narrow yards, so it could still be eaten, and they made potions from wild roots and bitter leaves to ease pain. Daily life felt like a forced breath. There were no longer children's laughter on the streets, no sound of a bustling market, only the slow footsteps of people still trying as if the world might return to normal. One of the most italicized, one most often mentioned habits was how they lit candles every time the sun set, not only in their homes, but also at every crossroads. It's as if those small lights could keep out the darkness that carried disease. People sat close to that light, repeating prayers or old stories. Though sometimes their voices were hoarse from coughing, there was also the habit of hanging wet cloths in front of doors, believed to trap bad air before it entered the house, though no one could be sure whether it truly worked or merely gave a little sense of safety. The women who were still healthy were sometimes seen weaving with trembling hands, producing simple cloths that were used more often as shrouds for the dead than as clothing, while the old men tried to repair the fences of the fields, even though no one planted there anymore. All these activities were carried out not because they believed better days would come, but because their bodies and memories did not know how to stop. As if routine was the only thing preventing them from drowning in fear. The village that once had the rhythm of life now ticked faintly, like an old clock nearly out of power, yet still trying to strike once more, only so it would not sink immediately into silence. Those who later wrote down this story described that atmosphere as a form of resistance that was not loud. Resistance that lived through simple actions. Through the fire of the stove, through the small candle, through hands that still tried to weave, though the thread's almost gone. All of it was small fragments of life, trying to persist even as the shadow of death grew closer. And from those small fragments, we can imagine how the silence slowly swallowed everything. After most of the houses became empty, the objects left behind became the most faithful, silent witnesses. In the dusty corner of a kitchen, a clay bowl was found with dried porridge still clinging to it, as if its owner had left the spoon inside and never returned. On a cracked wooden table there were still stains of wine. The color faded into a dull purple mixed with dust, while the long bench near the fireplace had one broken leg, yet still stood crooked, as if waiting for someone to sit once more on the floor. A spool of thread lay unrolled, its strands forming irregular patterns. Blown by the wind from a broken window in the quiet bedroom. A wooden bed had only a crumpled blanket. With a damp smell, perhaps left by a sick child, a wooden toy shaped like a small horse still lay beside the pillow, as though its little owner would soon return to hug it. But never did. In the barn, a rusty hoe and a woven basket still held remnants of straw, both waiting for hands that would never come. On the walls of houses there were faint scratches, perhaps made by the nails of restless people or simply scribbles of children, whose voices could no longer be heard in the abandoned fields. There was a rope, loosely tied to a wooden post once used to tether livestock, now swaying gently in the wind on the main village road. An overturned wooden cart still lay there, its wheel broken, the load of grain inside already rotting and merging with the soil. As if the village stopped moving right at that point, these small objects gave the impression that life never truly ended in a dramatic way, but rather slowly decayed, leaving faint traces of human hands that were once busy, now only mute. And if someone were to walk past all those remnants, perhaps what would be felt most was not only the absence of people, but the absence of movement, the absence of voices, the absence of the small rhythms that once made the village alive, as if those objects wished to tell a story, but could only wait in silence, decaying with time, covered in dust, until finally no one remembered who had last touched them. Night in the abandoned village felt like an endless sheet without human conversation, without the clinking of cups or the soft songs that once came from houses. There was only the wind slipping through cracks in the frail wood, carrying a rustling sound that resembled faint whispers above the collapsing rooftops. Bats flew in and out, their wings making a trembling sound that sometimes resembled distant laughter, while in the yards wild grass grew unchecked, covering the paths once often walked by small feet toward the well. Now nothing more than damp, moss-covered trails. Nocturnal insects dominated the empty space, filling the silence with their unending hum. A monotonous rhythm of nature. From the distant hills came the occasional howl of wolves, their echoes entering the village that no longer had guard dogs, and as if each howl was a marker that humans had lost, that the wild world had reclaimed its right. The moon hung pale in the sky, its light falling into empty windows, casting long shadows inside houses, shadows that moved as though people were walking, though no one was there, only the play of light within emptiness. The trees at the edge of the village stretched toward the collapsing houses, their roots crawling into the cracks of stone foundations, piercing broken walls, and little by little, the village became part of the growing forest. In the air lingered the scent of damp soil mixed with rotting wood. And if someone stood there long enough, they might feel as though the village was taking a deep breath. Not with human lungs, but with the lungs of earth, forest, and sky. The silence of the night was no longer an empty silence, but one full of wildlife slowly erasing human traces, so that the village, once alive with the sound of markets and footsteps, now became a space in between, not fully dead, yet not fully alive, like a long sleep that never ended. As time passed without record, the remains of humans, once lived in the village began to merge with the soil the simple graves once marked. With small stones or rough wooden crosses were no longer visible. The wood had rotted into fragments consumed by moss and insects. The gravestones tilted into the earth, covered by fallen leaves that piled up year after year until the signs of who rested beneath them disappeared, leaving only level ground. No different from the rest of the wild field bones once perhaps exposed by stray dogs or wolves were slowly covered by earth, stained by the roots of trees that grew through their gaps and eventually became part of the forest itself, no longer distinguishing between human or animal bodies, all blending into a silent cycle. Inside the houses left behind, small objects still remained: a cracked wooden spoon, a clay plate with a broken rim, a ragged cloth stiffened by dust, pieces of candles that no longer burned. All remained as if waiting for hands that never returned. In the corner of a room, a small cloth doll with a faded face stared blankly, its stitched eyes almost undone, yet still there as if holding the silence of the child who never returned to embrace it. And in the collapsed barn, the bones of cows and goats mingled with broken wood, a sign that the animals too were drawn into this long silence. There was no longer a clear separation between human life and wildlife. No longer a hierarchy placing humans above all. Here, everything was the same part of the same earth. And in that silence, the abandoned village seemed to transform into a kind of monument. Not a monument built of marble or grand stone, but a living monument formed of roots, grass, moss, and nameless remnants, a memorial told by no one except the silence itself, which whispered to the wind that there was once a time when humans lived here, then left, and never returned. As the village was gradually swallowed by the forest, the people who lived in nearby settlements began to forget its original name. They only called it the land that must not be visited. A place of misfortune, a region considered taboo by villagers living several miles away. Children were forbidden to play near the path leading there. The elders warned in low voices that anyone daring to cross the forest boundary would return with empty eyes, or never return at all. Such stories spread from generation to generation, growing from whispers meant at first only to frighten children, yet over time becoming a belief so deep that even adults dared not disprove it. On nights when the wind blew harder, strange sounds were said to be heard, like branches snapping when no animal was near, like wooden doors creaking, though the houses had long collapsed. Some even swore they saw faint lights flickering in the distance, as if candles were lit in windows of houses no longer standing. Long shadows dancing among the trees, though no light remained except the pale moon. Other stories claimed that at certain times, if someone walked too close, they would hear footsteps following from behind, though when they turned, only empty forest and thin mist were there. A coldness piercing the bones made them run back to their village and never look again, because the belief grew stronger. The dead village slowly became a space untouched, surrounded by layers of thickening mystery. People did not know if something truly haunted the place, or if it was only the echo of memories of humans who once lived there. Yet fear mixed with reverence made them choose to keep their distance, and from that distance new myths were born. that the village was inhabited by the souls of those who died of the plague, that they walked at night carrying dim lanterns, searching for their lost homes, or waiting for strangers to come so they might have company. The belief endured not because anyone proved it, but precisely because no one dared approach far enough to see the truth. There were a few who eventually tried to test the boundary. It's usually not from the nearby villages, but strangers. Traveling merchants who had heard the stories and believed that no place was truly frightening for those who lived by the road, or wanderers seeking strange experiences to take home as tales. Even some young monks who came with faith that prayer could dispel all fear. These people stepped onto the path already closed by roots and undergrowth. They passed rotting wooden fences, saw the foundation stones of houses mostly sunk into the soil. Through the mist, they glimpsed vague shapes. Posts standing without roofs, walls half collapsed, hearths long gone cold, the silence so deep that every footstep rang out. And often they stopped only to be sure no other sound followed them. Some returned quickly, saying the air there was different, as if heavier to breathe, as though each breath carried with it the scent of damp earth mixed with rotting wood, and somehow also a faint trace, the smell of burned cloth, or the sweat of humans who once labored and now left only echoes. Others came back pale, unable to explain what they saw, only saying their eyes had caught something moving in a window that no longer had glass, or a shadow crossing between broken walls. Some heard whispers so close, yet no one was there. They tried to utter prayers loudly, but their own voices seemed to be thrown back at them by walls that were not real. Strangest of all were the stories of time itself shifting. Some said they had walked only a short while. But when they returned, the day was far later than they imagined. As if within the village time moved in another manner, slower or faster. No one could be sure. One thing was certain: the more people tried to enter, the fewer dared to recount their experiences clearly, because words seemed unable to capture the strange weight pressing on their chests, making their sleep restless, making them hear footsteps at night even after they had gone home. Thus the rumors of the dead village did not weaken, but instead grew stronger, for every incomplete story only allowed imagination to fill the emptiness with something more terrifying. As the years passed, the story of the dead village no longer circulated only by word of mouth near the forest, but began to spread to more distant villages, even to small monasteries, where extraordinary events were. Recorded in ink and parchment, the monks who heard the tales from wanderers felt compelled to write them down, not with the intention of frightening, but as a sign that there was a place in the world that did not follow the usual rhythm. They wrote of a village at the edge of the forest once lively, but now empty, and though empty, it still held a strong presence, as if the remaining stones and wood preserved the echoes of a vanished life. Some records claimed the village disappeared due to a curse. Others said the plague carried away all its people within days. And still others suggested the ground beneath the village concealed something older than humankind, something that did not wish to be disturbed and thus forced men away. The monks copied the tale in careful language. They offered no conclusions, only what they had heard, leaving readers to interpret on their own. And precisely because of this, the story grew more compelling, arriving like an unfinished puzzle piece. Each village that heard it began adding new details. Some claimed to have seen green light rising above the ruins. Others spoke of the sound of small bells, though no church remained. Even a story told of a dog that entered and returned with fur turned completely white, as though it had aged in an instant. Such tales multiplied and spread. No one could say what was true. Yet all reinforced the image of the dead village as a mirror of a past never resolved. And slowly, the place became part of the collective imagination. Not merely a location, but a symbol of how death and silence could endure far longer than the life that once was. Those who never saw it still felt as though they knew it, as though they could picture its empty streets, its fallen houses, and the mist that always covered it. So the village lived in two places at once, in the silent forest and in the minds of all who heard its story. In the end, the dead village was no longer told merely as a strange tale, but came to be seen as a silent warning, as though it were a monument not built by human hands, but by time itself. A monument standing not with pillars of stone, but with enduring silence. Those who heard its story began to view it as a mirror of human fragility. How everything painstakingly built could vanish at once, not through war, nor through visible disaster, but by something often unseen and incomprehensible, a plague perhaps. Or maybe just small changes overlooked until all collapsed. The dead village became a reminder that humanity only lingers briefly in a world far older, and that earth, trees, and air will remain even when human voices are gone. Many never dared approach, yet in their minds the village lived as a lesson that needed no explanation. It was enough to exist, enough to linger as a shadow at the forest's edge to remind them that everything can disappear without a clear reason. Wanderers passing through the region sometimes stopped at a distance, not to enter, but to gaze at the tree line that seemed darker than usual. And in that gaze, they felt as though looking at their own future, a future that would one day fall silent, though in a different form. The monasteries that preserved the records of the village recopied the tale from generation to generation, not because they knew the truth, but because they understood that an unresolved mystery is stronger than a certain answer. And thus the village endured, not in stone or wood, but in the narrative retold again and again, becoming a legend without end, a quiet legend without cries. Only a whisper that there was once a place inhabited by people, and now, standing as an empty space that spoke louder than 100 words. And perhaps that is why even today, anyone who hears the story of the dead village feels something hard to explain. A kind of coolness mingled with fear, a gentle reminder that life is always fragile and mystery is always vaster than human understanding. Yet the longer people contemplated the story of the dead village, the more details began to feel unnatural, as though something darker was hidden beneath the tale told merely as a cautionary legend. Some old records noted that before the village truly fell silent, its inhabitants did not vanish all at once, but one by one in a strange pattern. As if there was an unseen turn being taken, a farmer disappeared without a trace in spring. Then months later, a shepherd vanished while driving his sheep to the field. And after that, an old woman never returned from the well. Each time one person vanished, the village tried to carry on, but fear grew thicker, until at last, when their numbers had dwindled, that fear turned into resignation. There were no screams, no resistance, only silence growing heavier, as if they knew whatever was working around them could not be fought. This legend made many wonder whether the village was truly emptied by plague or by something harder to explain. For plagues usually came with clear signs: stench, rotting bodies, coughs, and cries. Yet the records left about this village emphasized the absence of such signs. All that was noted was silence and the vanishing of people one by one, like shadows swallowed by darkness, until nothing remained. And the houses were left in order, food still sitting on the tables, as if life had stopped mid-step. The monastic scribes recorded this detail not to frighten, but because they themselves were puzzled. They did not know what to call it: disease, curse, or simply fate, and here the mystery deepened further, letting people drift into a soft uncertainty, whispering that perhaps there are things never meant to be understood by humankind. Centuries after the village had vanished, travelers who lost their way along the old path sometimes reported things that made their skin prickle, not in the form of sudden terror, but in a strange vibration difficult to explain. They told how when walking through the forest that once surrounded the village, the atmosphere shifted as though time slowed down. Footsteps grew heavier, the air denser, and the sounds of birds and insects suddenly disappeared. As if the whole landscape had stopped breathing, some said they saw a dim light in the distance, like an oil lamp, flickering in a window, though every house had long since collapsed, and when they tried to approach the glow, it went out, leaving total darkness. Others claimed to smell the aroma of fresh bread, though there was no oven, no fire, no working kitchen. Only moss-covered stones cold to the touch. One or two even swore they heard faint voices, ordinary conversations. Someone asking the price of grain or exchanging news of the harvest, the sound drifting as if from the empty fields before vanishing without trace. Such accounts were seldom spoken of seriously, for who would believe what was told only by wanderers weary or lost? Yet the fragments persisted, written in the margins of travelogues, scribbled in the edges of monastery manuscripts, or in letters never sent, all hinting that though the village had died centuries ago, its presence was not entirely gone, as if space and time held a reflection of the life that once breathed there, letting people glimpse it for a moment before pulling it back. And the longer the mystery endured, the more people began to feel that perhaps the village never truly died at all, but was trapped in a state between neither alive nor wholly dead, simply lingering, waiting, with secrets that would never be revealed until the end of days. Those who heard these stories often found themselves torn between the urge to believe and the instinct to dismiss. Some claimed it was nothing but the imagination of wanderers worn down by long journeys. For the forest and the old road often tricked the eyes and ears. Yet there were a few who clung to the belief that the vanished village still breathed in some lair unreachable to ordinary people. They argued that the mass death brought by the Black Death had left scars too deep to simply disappear. Screams, prayers, and unfinished cries may have clung to the air and seeped into the soil, then echoed back to whoever passed through certain paths. as though time there did not move forward but circled endlessly. A monk once wrote that while praying in the old chapel near the ruins, he felt as though hundreds of voices whispered around him, not hostile, not welcoming, simply resonating. Like prayers that never reached the heavens, he confessed that when the sensation faded, his heart was filled with a grief he could not understand, grief that was not his own. And for years afterward, he remembered it with a bitter weight, as though he had brushed against something that should never be touched. Other travelers reported similar feelings, a strange sense of loss, as if mourning someone they had never known. The sensation would come suddenly, linger briefly, then vanish, leaving behind a hollow space in the chest impossible to explain. For this reason, even if only a few truly believed, the village lived on in stories whispered at inns, in marketplaces, or in rural homes when nights stretched too long. And each time the tale was retold, its mystery deepened, as though time itself conspired to ensure the secret was never fully buried, but always resurfaced in vague and fleeting forms, never clear, yet always enough to make one wonder if something beyond reach was still waiting to be found. There exists an old record said to have been discovered in the library of a northern monastery. Written in trembling handwriting, the author unknown. Only a faint initial in the corner of the page within it lay the confession of someone who had once passed through the area believed to be the vanished village he wrote that one autumn night. When fog thickened and the forest path nearly disappeared, he saw a faint light in the distance. Not the flame of a torch, nor the moon hidden by clouds, but a dim glow that seemed to spill from the windows of small houses, believing it to be a settlement he hoped for shelter. Yet the closer he walked, the further the light receded, and then a sound arose, faint and fragile like a chant sung in low tones, not a church hymn, not a song of revelry, but more like a melody, incomplete, as if a verse had been lost or cut short. He wrote that his heart raced, not from fear, but from the unsettling sense that he was approaching something he should recognize, but could not. When he finally reached a clearing, the fog lifted to reveal silhouettes of crumbling structures. Their walls cracked, their roofs sagging, yet light still glimmered from within the gaps. He tried to step closer, but the air grew unbearably heavy, suffocating, and then everything went dark. When he awoke, he found himself back on the main road, far from that place, with only a coldness biting into his bones. The record ended there, as though the writer could not continue, and to this day it remains hidden behind wooden shelves, rarely opened, rarely spoken of. For those who have read it all claim the same thing, that something within the writing did not only reach the eyes, but crept into the mind, planting images that refused to leave even after the book was closed, like an echo from a place that should have long vanished, but somehow endures at the edge of human awareness. Several researchers intrigued by the record attempted to retrace the location described, bringing maps, compasses, and old route notes believed to lead there. Their journey began at a village still standing on the forest's edge, a small settlement with moss-covered stone houses and an ancient well at its square. The villagers spoke little. Some shook their heads when asked about the vanished hamlet. Others merely shrugged as though they knew nothing, yet their eyes betrayed a guarded knowledge. as if what they carried was not meant to be shared but preserved, lest history repeat itself. As the researchers entered the forest, the atmosphere shifted. Birdsong faded until only the rustle of leaves remained. Footsteps on damp earth grew heavier than expected. The air carried the scent of wet soil mingled with rotting wood. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the path was no ordinary track. Trees grew too close together. Forming natural walls, branches hung low, nearly sealing the way the sky, visible only in small fragments between dark foliage. They marked each step with strips of cloth to avoid losing their way, yet at times, the very strip they had tied moments before reappeared, hanging ahead, as though the path circled back without ever moving forward. One researcher noted a disturbing pattern that distances felt longer than they should. Yet when checked, the compass needles spun aimlessly, trembling as if tugged by unseen hands. Night fell sooner than expected. Fog descended heavy, and within it came a faint odor. Not merely dampness, but the stench of cloth left too long in a closed room, mingled with rust. They pressed on carefully until from the distance came a peculiar sound, like stones struck softly with wood, repeating, not loud, but enough to raise every hair on their skin. One of them tried to record it with a small device, yet when played back, only a low hum emerged, unexplainable. That night, they camped by a narrow river, lighting a fire against the chill. But the fire never burned brightly, always pale and smoky, as though the wood resisted flame. In their notes, it was written that night was the first in which they all shared the same dream, of empty houses with open windows, and within those windows stood shadowed figures, motionless, watching, never speaking. At dawn, each awoke pale. None spoke of the dream, yet all knew the others had seen it too. From that moment, their journey ceased being research alone, becoming instead a passage into a layer of reality that could not be entirely explained. The following days in their travel notes revealed that the longer the researchers remained in the forest, the stranger the conditions grew, as if time there followed no law of the outside world. The sun rose too late and set too soon. Watches stopped or ran backward, while their steps always seemed to return to the same point. One of them wrote of hearing his name called softly from the brush, a faint but unmistakable voice mimicking the tone of his mother long dead. Another claimed to see the shadow of a child running among the trees, dressed in garments of centuries past. When they tried to follow, the figure vanished, leaving only falling leaves. The second night weighed heavier than the first. Their dreams grew sharper. All of them dreamed of walking through an empty village with cracked stone paths, every house with doors ajar, yet none dared to enter, for from within came long whispers like prayers repeated endlessly in an unknown tongue, soothing and unsettling at once, as though a ritual persisted without end. One researcher recorded that in his dream he saw a well in the village center, filled with black water that reflected nothing, only pure darkness, and when he stared deeper, pale, faceless visages stared back, silent and unblinking. Waking from such dreams left them more exhausted, as though sleep no longer restored, but only drew them deeper into the past's shadows. On the third day, their path brought them to a clearing in the forest. encircled by great oaks, centuries old. At its center stood a flat-topped boulder carved with faint markings, circles and lines repeated in strange patterns. One epigrapher among them declared the script matched no known alphabet. But the circular symbols resembled those used in ancient medical records to mark plague outbreaks. They chose to rest near the stone, but nightfall brought what could not be ignored. The fire they lit extinguished suddenly without cause, and in the absolute dark, footsteps circled their camp slow, deliberate, watchful. Yet when they turned on their lights, nothing was there, only thickening fog. Fear gradually replaced curiosity, and their journals revealed that some began to doubt continuing. Yet others insisted they had gone too far to turn back, for every step now was more than a physical journey. It was as if the forest itself wished to tell them a story long buried, though not in human words, but in dreams, whispers, and faint signs that always left more questions than answers. The final notes discovered from their journey revealed something even harder to explain than the dreams and shadows before. On the fourth night, they recorded that the fog descending was no longer ordinary mist, but a thick curtain that swirled and seemed to follow their steps. As they pressed deeper, they found a straight, cobbled path, as if deliberately laid to lead them toward a village absent from any map. Wooden houses stood frail, roofs slanted, walls thick with moss, doors left ajar. And in some windows they swore they saw figures standing motionless. These figures made no sense. Their bodies taller than ordinary men, heads nearly touching the upper frames. And when they tried to focus, the figures vanished, leaving only empty, creaking windows stirred by wind. The sound grew clearer, no longer mere whispers, but a low chant repeated endlessly, echoing from a building at the road's end. It was a chapel, its tower half collapsed, door ajar, dim candlelight seeping through the crack. They approached cautiously, but the nearer they drew, the chant deepened into groans, heavy with sorrow. One researcher wrote that at that moment he felt the village was not merely empty, but trapped in time, a fragment of the past replaying its grief. Inside the chapel they found rows of decayed pews, each holding neatly folded black cloth, as though waiting for their owner's return. Upon the altar lay a great leather-bound book, open to a page filled with names, each followed by a small cross mark, like a death record. The page was so crowded with entries that the black ink bled into heavy blotches, almost obscuring the parchment. One among them touched the page, and at once the air turned frigid, breaths grew heavy. Footsteps approached from outside, the chapel door groaning louder as though something pressed to enter. They slammed the book shut, but the cold did not lift. Instead, it pierced deeper into their bones. The notes ended here, the pen seemingly dropped in haste, ink splattering across the last lines, blotting them into unreadable darkness. Nothing explained what happened after, whether they escaped the village or not. All that remained was a faint trace, leaving any reader with a sense of having glimpsed something never meant to be seen. The final layer of mystery was not an answer but a realization that some places in the world refuse to be fully told. As though past tragedies choose to endure in silence, and any who attempt to uncover them will always end suspended in unanswered. Questions met only by a lingering hush. And here we pause at the final page of a tale that was never whole. A winding journey through the mists of history, through traces of those long gone who still leave shadows on the ground beneath our feet. We can only imagine how their last steps echoed across the cold, cobbled streets, how the wind carried their names written in that black book now unreadable. There is something soothing in realizing not everything must be answered, that mystery itself is. Part of our sleep-like dreams without beginning or end, drifting in and leaving only a faint feeling we do not wish to let go. Perhaps those lost never truly departed. Perhaps they still stand in old windows gazing out, or sit on the chapel's decayed pews waiting for something that never comes. And we are only visitors who wandered too close to their world, a world caught between time and silence. History gives us records of the plague-cold numbers, long lists of the dead. But behind those numbers were breath's eyes that once gazed, hands that once held, and now all that remains is an echo. Faint and fragile, as if the world wishes to guard their secrets gently, like a mother pulling a blanket over her child's face when the night grows too cold. So let this story close in peace. Let the questions linger in the air like distant stars. And let your sleep tonight be filled with the images of quiet streets, old chapels, and whispering winds, not to frighten you, but to remind you that within silence there is calm within mystery. There is space to rest, and not all doors are meant to be opened, for some doors exist only to remain shut, awaiting a time that never comes. Sleep then, in peace, and let this unfinished history become your lullaby. A bedtime tale not searching for answers, but simply keeping you company through the night, until dawn comes with its light, and all things return to their haze, just as they were always meant to.